So hey, good afternoon, everyone. As it says, we're going to go through and talk about basically how we avoid zero trust or silos. So one of the things that we've noticed from a ping identity standpoint as we've talked to various organizations is that as they're building out their zero trust solutions, they tend to have dedicated teams. Teams that are going to go for the ICAM solution, teams that are going to go for the data solutions, the networking solutions. And some of the things that we've run into is that these teams aren't necessarily talking to one another. And that leads to, I think, some kind of miscommunication, but also sets up to where later on, the zero trust collaboration may not work as originally intended. But then again, there have been some other examples, and I'll talk about one of those for sure, and maybe one or two others, where the groups have talked. And from that, you end up with a stronger, more cohesive story, and really what the intent of zero trust was around. So a little bit of an overview of who I am. My name is Brian Rosensteel. I am the field CTO for US Federal for Ping Identity. And I've spent a good deal of my career within and around the government. 20 years in the overall US public sector, 14 of those specifically dedicated to FICAM, Federal Identity Credential Access Management. Started in the IC, done some work in the Federal Civilian Executive Branch, done a lot of advisory work with the NCCOE, ATARC, even some work up in the Federal Bridge. And I tell you all of that to let you know that I am a diehard identity nut. I always tell people, if you cut me open, I bleed PKI. I've worked in either directly with pretty much every enterprise MFA or around it. And I'll be the very first one to tell you and stand up, and I'm standing before you now, identity has no intrinsic inherent value. We always talk about identity being valuable, but it's not that identity itself has any value. Identity's value is derived from what it protects, the things that have true inherent value. And one of those, of course, being data. And I don't mean data like, the attributes of a user that we store in a directory. That's still identity. I mean like the drone feed that we're pulling in, the human intelligence from our confidential informants letting us know about terrorist movement activities, what we're doing out within other types of data collection and soil samples that we're pulling in. That's data with inherent value. And the value of identity gets derived from that data. And it's important to keep that in mind so that as we go through our modernization efforts, we know, hey, the reason why we're doing this is not because we like this shiny new authenticator, and I like shiny authenticators, but we're doing it to make the mission objectives more attainable. We see that when we actually look at how the zero trust pillars were set up. So this is for on the civilian side, this are the 5 pillars of zero trust from CISA. Notice, left-hand side, what do we see? Identity. What's on the far right-hand side? Data. That's not a coincidence. When CISA made this model, they bookended zero trust with identity and data, with the intention of having those working together. When we look at the DoD model, we see this, I think, even more clear. Now, of course, the DoD has a different model. It's pretty much all things DoD. They have 7 pillars instead of 5. And what's in the dead center? Data. What's on the far left? The user pillar or the identity pillar. The idea being, identity being that gateway in to protect what truly has value. We see that when we look at the broader controls. Of course, I could have put up the controls from the civilian side, but I like the DoD controls because it's more fleshed out. We're going to spend the rest of my 30 minutes going through these one by one. No, I mean, obviously, this is an eye chart if there ever was one. But you notice the majority in the gray, which is the data pillar. There's a lot of items. Up in the top in the green pillar, that's the user, the identity pillar. There are a lot of items. The majority of those 91 and broader 152 controls fall within those 2 pillars. The idea being that when they can work together, when you have your data teams and your identity teams working together, the sum is greater than the whole of the parts. I also really love starting any presentation, any talk that I give, talking about ICAM and the formal definition. Now, this isn't Ping Identity's definition. This is a definition directly from the government. And you've probably seen this before, but I know there's some people who may not be as familiar with identity. We're also recording this, so for that audience as well. ICAM, or Identity Credential Access Management, being tools, policy systems for enabling the right individual, right resource, right time, right reason, support of that federal business objective. I like this definition for 2 reasons. One, the first part about it, tools, policies, and systems working together. For that reason, no vendor, including Ping Identity, can actually provide you a full ICAM solution. It's not possible by definition. We need to be working as a collaborative effort from understanding the policy. Vendors don't create policy. We can help inform, we can help advise. I've spent a lot of my career doing that and saying, hey, from a best practice, we think you should be doing this. But ultimately, we need to understand the policy coming from the government, and that's going to shape our technology. The other part about it is notice we're working with tools and systems. Those are plural. This is about enhance and extend existing environments, not rip and replace. Not, oh, to do your modernization, stand down what you've been working on for the last several decades, right? That's not the way forward. The other part about this that I like is when we're talking about identity, we're talking about authorization. Most of the time, people think of authentication. What is my shiny authenticator? What is my PIV? What is my CAC? And I love the PIV and the CAC. But notice in this definition, that's just right individual. That's not right resource, right time, right reason, right objective. Those are all authorizations. And so from the heart of this definition, we see it must be collaborative, it must be built around authorization, and that's the focus of most of the zero trust efforts that we're seeing out there. And I'll talk a lot about that today. Before I do, because I do want to make sure that we're understanding this needs to be a collaborative effort between data, between identity, I want to talk very briefly about just one of the flurry of documents that we've seen come out from NIST and others. I could spend the rest of the day on this. I'm one of those weird people. When a new NIST special publication drops, I get excited. I want some popcorn. We're in Baltimore, so you put Old Bay on your popcorn. If you've never done that, you need to try it. It's amazing. But most people probably aren't nearly as excited, and that's fine. I do want to talk about one of those specifically, though. Obviously, there's a bunch that have come out, but the one I want to focus on is NIST Special Publication 800-217. Now, this is still in public draft, but from the conversations I've had with NIST, most of what I'm about to talk about we think is going to maintain through the final version. And these are really important to keep in mind because these are going to have an impact on your application owners and on your data owners. So when we look at those, and primarily it's in section 5 and 6, and like I said, there's a lot within 217 that I would have liked to have seen. There's a lot in 217 that people have had lots of fun conversations about, and we can do that after the camera's turned off. But these, I think NIST had good justification for putting in. So what am I talking about? Well, the first one is around using a cryptographically random value for your identifier. Don't use your UPN, your subject alternative name, your email address, or RFC 822. You need to use a random cryptographic value instead of something that can point to an individual. The other things that they put in is no longer putting any type of attribute or authorization information inside of the assertions, what we call front channel. So in my SAML assertion, I shouldn't be putting in the role and the various attributes of that individual. I shouldn't be doing authorizations through scopes and claims within OIDC. All of that needs to be passed through back channel. So what is driving NIST to do this? Well, there's a recognition that the majority of federation that's going on out there, and if you're not familiar with federation, this is around the common term people talk about a single sign-on. I actually don't like that term because federation's more than just, hey, I get single sign-on, I only authenticate once and I get everywhere. When we look at TIC 3.0, we set up trust zones, we don't have to do multiple authentications. Certain resources we should always authenticate through. And NIST has outlined this within 863, and they talk about 3 different assurance levels, FAL 1, 2, 3. And of course, while certain vendors like Ping Identity, we support all 3. By the way, don't do FAL 3, and I'll tell you why when the mic's turned off. It's just too complicated. But FAL 1 and 2, you should be doing. And FAL 2 talks about encrypting the contents. So in Zero Trust, we assume breach. And we know we've got TLS set up, so we want to be encrypting the communication that occurs between the federation and the application. But the applications don't support it. Some applications do, the majority of them don't. So we haven't been able to implement FAL2, and NIST recognizes this. So what's the problem? Well, I assume breach, I assume an attacker's on the network, and they're going to start listening to the traffic. They're going to start listening to the federation. They're going to see, oh, this is Brian Rosensteel. Oh, what attributes does he have? Oh, he's an admin. Oh, I like this application. Oh, this is the structure and syntax that I need if I'm going to end up doing a golden SAML attack. And golden SAMLs, unfortunately, are no longer theoretical. We're seeing them in the wild. We're seeing them more common than they should be. We're seeing OIDC even being taken advantage of when it's implemented poorly. And so by understanding, oh, these are the scopes, these are the claims that I need, this is the syntax that I need, I can start engineering in a sophisticated attack. And in the government, sophisticated attacks are what we should be expecting. So NIST is saying, don't put it in there, put it in a back channel where it can be better protected. And I think that there's strong justification for doing it. But what is the result? Well, application owners have struggled with FAL2. How many of those same applications do you think are going to work when it comes down to this more complicated back channel? The answer is an even smaller subset. So we need to understand that as we do our modernization, what is the impact that's going to have on application owners? Hey, you struggled enough with all the rapid changes, now we're asking you to change your application even more. There's going to be a lot of backlash. Moreover, there are certain applications that have struggled where they only do header injection. And we may not have the luxury of going in and modernizing those for not only SAML, but OIDC, and OIDC with the right profile to do what it needs to do. Now, this is a culture challenge that we're running into. When you ask an organization who's responsible for protecting the data, the application owner or the data scientist will tend to raise their hand and say, oh, that's my responsibility. But the ICAM team is saying, hey, wait a second, the new tools we're bringing in can help you. And this is where that communication needs to happen. We're not taking away the fact that an application owner can put in their own authorizations, but we're saying we can make it so that we can do things more securely and enable the authorizations to supplement and to enhance what you're able to do today. So now we're going to talk a little bit about authorization directly, and this is one of my favorite quotes. I've abused this quote, it's not mine, but I love it. It's so simple. Authentication is merely the enabler of authorization. And that's critical. We see that within the formal definition of ICAM. We see that in what's coming down with the various NIST documentation. So what does that mean? So I'm going to go through, and I know some people in there, I've worked for a long time, I see some friendly faces. I know they already know a lot about identity, but there's some new faces as well, and like I said, it's being recorded. So I'll do an overview of like authentication versus authorization, but this is not, in the past, this is really what we're doing for our modernization efforts for proper zero trust implementation. So the first, in authentication, we notice we're no longer authenticating directly to the application. Instead, we're running that through a federation engine. And again, I like to use the term federation engine versus single sign-on because it really requires a lot more sophistication when we look at the requirements of zero trust today. Up here I actually have the term federation hub, which is an even kind of more niche use case where we understand the authoritative source of the identity may not be within my organization. It may be external to my organization, but my access control is my responsibility. We see this a lot in the DoD. We've been working with them around what were known as the 8110 environments. These are known as mission partner environments, our Five Eyes communities, our collaboration with coalition members, where, hey, that identity must live with that other nation, or we run into issues around international agreements. So that's why I like to use the term Federation Hub. In addition to that, so we've moved it down to this authentication authority, this federation engine. What does that give us? Well, now I can start building out what we really want to do in authentication, making the user go from an unknown to a known state. So what does that mean? That means orchestrating in lots of other technologies. Remember a formal definition, tools, policies, systems working together? So this means, let me reach out to the agents you already have deployed. Don't deploy yet another agent just to do the identity aspect, but hey, if you've got something like, I don't know, like CrowdStrike running out there and they're doing a risk score or another type of maybe a UEBA that you've got running, let me utilize that system with my integrations that I have, pull in that data. Maybe you're doing something for identifying is this BYOD or GFE, right? So maybe you've got an MDM like a Microsoft Intune or one of the other ones that are out there. Let me call them. Is this device a device that is managed and known, or does it fall in the BYOD category? I want to know that information. Or I've got a technology partner on Windows that can give me information out of BIOS. So now I can know, hey, what's the chipset being reported out of BIOS? So that if later on, all of a sudden there's a vulnerability in a chipset, I can make an access control decision very, very quickly and make that change. The other part about this is understanding how the user's logging in. What type of authenticator are they using? Are they using a phishing-resistant authenticator, like a PIV card? Or are they using something that is more phishable, like that push authenticator on the mobile device? There are times when a phishable authenticator might be okay, but we need to know how they logged in because we might need to be restricting access to the more sensitive applications. But the key to this and understanding the difference between authentication and authentication stops after we build up that user to know who they are. So we built up the digital ID, the context of how they've come in, and we make the determination, can they get into this application? That's where authorization takes over. And this is where we start seeing really interesting things with what's going on with the efforts around data. So authorization seeks to say, all right, I already know who the user is. You brought them from the unknown to the known state. Now, does this identity have the right permissions to perform this action? And that's a singular request, which means every time the user's doing something, we run an authorization event. This is where we get into this notion of continuous monitoring, continuous authorizations from a zero trust perspective. So what does this actually mean? Well, we need to break down the digital identity, the context. Some of it's going to be RBAC decisions. And we hear a lot about ABAC versus RBAC, and RBAC needs to go away. That's not true. RBAC, role-based access control, is this person an admin? What department are they in? What function do they have? That needs to persist. But ABAC actually contains RBAC as a subset. So that's what they talk about, elevating up to ABAC. So that's what we mean by a directory attribute, a persistent attribute, something that's more permanently stored. In addition, let's take the context. Did they come in with that phishable credential? Did they come in with a phishing resistant? Where did it come in from? Was it a physical PIV card, or did it come from mobile devices? We know mobile devices today don't support AAL3. They don't have the FIPS validations. So we might need to differentiate based upon the resource that we're going to. We need to look at the device attributes, GFE versus BYOD. And then the really exciting part for people like me, the metadata aspect. So we know there's a lot of efforts going on within the data pillars of being able to categorize the data that's out there, classify the data if need be. So with that metadata tagging, I can take a look at it and make decisions. This individual in my coalition partner environment, right, they're a foreign national. They need to gain access to the information. 80% of the information they want to get at is fine. 20% is tagged as no foreign. I should be accounting for that and building access control policies accordingly. And for some of the first times, we're able to do that now because of the efforts they're doing. And so when we have it where both sides are communicating, they start realizing, oh wait, you mean you can take the efforts that I'm doing and put in those more globalized access control decisions? That's awesome. I didn't know I could do that. Or, oh, you're doing that fine-grained data categorization? I'd have some power in my tools that I didn't know I could use before. Let me start testing that. How do we work together? So this allows us to start doing some really fun things. Let's look at our third-party entitlements. Let's look at what information you should be allowed to see. Let's look at what information you should be allowed to share. Maybe you can see it, but you don't have the authorization to share it. Or some of the fun ones, how long should you be allowed to look at that information? Right? If you're a contractor, how long is your VAR good for? Or the really fun one, have you done your annual cybersecurity awareness training? If you haven't, guess what? The only thing you're authorized to go to is the training. So these are the types of things we can start doing when we're looking at this broader context of that digital identity together. So a little bit about how Ping Identity can help to approach this. We do have a pretty full-fledged ICAM architecture. Now, most people know us for our federation engine, our federation hub. Or they might know us for what we can do on directory and how we can build out that master user record and do data synchronization across many different environments. We do have the ability to supply MFA for the government. For the government, we've restricted that to phishing resistant only, not more phishable form factors. But we also believe in BYOA, bring your own authenticator. You've got 2.5 decades of innovation within the CAC, 2 decades within the PIV. Let's utilize that as a primary authenticator. But let's also take advantage of what's going on within the derived realm. And if you need to have an interim credential or you need a credential for those who aren't PIV eligible, we might be able to help supply those as well. So the idea is not just, oh, it has to be a Ping credential, but let's just bring in strong authentication across the board. Now that's what we see on the left-hand side in red. That's all authentication. The authorization engines, and this is where Ping is doing a lot of our focus and a lot of our research and innovation, that's what we're seeing around the inbound and outbound ABAC engines. So what do we mean by inbound and outbound? Well, this has to do with where we might want to logically inject in a decision. Inbound, users going into an application or a subset of that application. Maybe they want to get into a tab, a URL, maybe they want to get into a folder, maybe they want to grab a subset of that data, execute an API. As they're going into the application and clicking through it, we can interrupt it and put in an authorization decision. That's what we mean by inbound. Now, outbound is a little bit different. Outbound is recognizing that modern applications are built around the notion that the application doesn't store the data. The data is an associated resource or database, and how does it get the data? It sends out an API call. So if we can take a look at the API signals coming out of the application, hence outbound, then we can sit there and end up making that determination by looking at the signal and modifying the payload that goes back, what that user should be able to see. This is where we get into, hey, that foreign national, the legitimate reason for them to be in the system for this coalition application, but some of the data that they're trying to grab isn't something that they should be able to see. Or this individual's only part of this organization. They can't retrieve this more sensitive data, or they're in finance, so they shouldn't be looking at the contract side, or whatever conflicts of interest there may be. Or you came in with an AAL2 credential on your mobile device. You need an AAL3, this is too sensitive. So we can push back, we can enforce that step-up authentication by looking at that with a more fine grain. The other thing that we've been doing a lot of is understanding that some of these more fine grain engines that we have in our outbound ABAC capabilities, you may want to inject those in at different levels. You may even want to bring them in during the authentication session. So we're making it so that our engines are more cohesive and more collaborative together. So how does this actually work in action? And what's going on? So one of the things that we've learned from Ping is some efforts that have been occurring, especially over in the DoD, around data regionalization through ABAC. And this is really interesting. So we have an issue. We do work as a country all over the world. And some of the work that we do is very sensitive. And we know that our information is highly prized. You know, the most attacked infrastructures on the planet, day in and day out, is the US government, which should be no surprise to anyone in this room. So when we send the data out, we know that that data is prized. We know that adversaries are targeting that data, and we know some of it's being intercepted. So what do? We encrypt it, right? We want to protect it. We put very strong encryption around it. However, that means the data is encrypted, which is great, but now we don't know what's inside of it as it gets sent overseas. So what ends up happening? Well, you could do one of two ways. You could take the approach of, well, let's give a descriptor of what's inside of this data. Is this an admiral's preferred sandwich list, or is this data pertaining to a new weapons system and the procedures for implementing it? Both, by the way, are sensitive and probably should be protected. But they're for two wildly different audiences. Or I've got data, and this is more common, that needs to go to the European theater versus the Pacific theater, but as we send it out, it may go to the wrong region. So if I put those descriptors in, what's going to end up happening so that people know, oh, I don't need to open this? Great. Reduces our time and effort because we end up having to decrypt everything. But then our adversaries know, oh, well, this is more pertinent to what I actually want to learn. Let me put my supercomputers against trying to crack the encryption on this blob of data versus the mountains of data that are coming out that I'm intercepting as a whole. So we know that's an operational risk. So what have we done instead? We've done option 2. Don't tag anything. Send it all out and have people whose jobs it is to decrypt everything and determine whether or not it's pertinent to where they are. That is a massive resource, sink, and that is something that the government's been trying to figure out, how do we do this better? So what's going on within Zero Trust? We're doing data tagging, metadata tagging. What's going on in the identity pillar? We're bringing in stronger ABAC authorizations. So now through some of the collaborations, like there's some work been done with one of my technology partners, Virtru, where what they can do is they'll do that metadata tagging and they'll rely upon the information that I'm gaining during the authentication and authorization events to sit there and say, we're going to do simple tagging, we're going to make a compromise and say this needs to go to the Indo-Pacific region, this needs to go to the European region, this needs to go to the African region, this needs to go to the South American region. And this should only be opened by people of this particular level. Not enough for an adversary to understand what's inside, but enough so that we can have the systems in place to say, oh, no, this data you don't even get to see. Because see, once I start doing this type of tagging and authorizations, it's not just about, oh, can you open this data? I can put in restrictions, can you even see this data? So now when I go into my tool set as my operator, I'll see, oh, I need to decrypt these things, because that's the only things that I'm authorized to be able to do. And so that's something that's really helping the government solve a challenge that we've had for years. And something where we're seeing the true data pillar efforts and identity pillar efforts working together in collaboration. So the last part about this is say, hopefully at this point you're like, oh yeah, this sounds really great, but where can I actually do it? So one of the things that I believe in very strongly, one of the things that Ping Identity believes in very strongly is this notion of reducing your standard operating procedures, that SOP reduction, full feature parity. This means whether I'm at the enterprise, the expeditionary, the tactical detail, the air-gapped environments, I should be able to train, and by the way, I used to be a sysadmin in the government, and it was so frustrating when I would deal, even technology from the same vendor, but depending on where it was deployed, I might have to use the software version, or I might have to use the cloud version, and I might as well have been using an entirely different set of software. So let me instead have an approach where it's the same API, it's the same procedure, it's the same training manual that becomes environmentally agnostic. And that's what we mean by full feature parity. And that's something that we focused on very, very strongly within the federal sector, so that no matter where our technology is deployed, and we can deploy in all of these areas, it is built around the same capabilities. And this is what you'll see when you look at the full offering of where we can be. We've got an ATO'd environment that you can purchase from Ping Identity that is IL5 certified. It is FedRAMP High from a SaaS environment perspective. Or, no, I don't want to use SaaS. I need to run it in my own private data centers. Great. We've got containerized solutions that you can deploy to be able to go into, whether it's going to be Google or Azure or AWS, be able to support it. Or, nope. Sorry, I wish I could do containerization, but I am still stuck on physical servers. And we have customers who tell that to us today. Can you give me a Windows MSI or executable? Can you give me a Linux tarball? And we can do that as well, so you can actually deploy this as an old traditional application, or some type of true hybrid scenario. And hybrid doesn't mean, at least in our mind, where you set it up and you have like a reverse proxy on premise that goes back out to a cloud environment, or you cache information. But instead, where we have true decision-making autonomy between different environments, but yet can rely upon information learned from the other environments together. That means if I lose internet connectivity, I'm not in a state of failing open or failing closed or in cached information that's only good for X number of days. Instead, I just continue to operate as normal, and once that communication comes back up, then I'm able to cross-communicate across the different environments. And that's one of the reasons why, the Navy did a study where they were able to determine in their DDIL environments, and the DDIL environment for the Navy is like an aircraft carrier that you see up here. In those environments, they really determined that our technology was able to not only meet the mission need, but meet the complexities of where those missions are deployed. So you'll see us recommend it a lot for those DDIL environments in the DoD. And we have similar types of environments that we're finding over in the civilian side as well. And then true air-gapped. You'll find us in some of the more sensitive parts of the government. We've been there for a long time. So that's it. That's a little bit of what we've been working on, things that we're passionate about, that cross-collaboration, making sure you don't have isolated teams that are only working on one part of the Zero Trust. They're going to need to be different teams. There's different expertises, but make sure they're communicating together, because again, the sum ends up being greater than the whole of the parts. So thank you very much. I think I've run basically up to time, but I'll be around afterwards if there are any questions.